August 7, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. As dawn rose over the Pacific, 11,000 United States Marines pushed ashore in what would become the first major Allied assault against the Empire of Japan. Operation Watchtower marked a decisive shift in the Pacific War. But beyond the naval clashes and jungle fighting that followed, an unexpected tool emerged in the thick darkness of the island's perimeter, one grounded not in steel or explosives, but in the basic framework of human language itself. The problem was immediate and deadly serious. In the confusion of jungle warfare, where visibility shrank to only a few feet in dense tropical foliage, and where the enemy sometimes spoke English or wore-captured American uniforms, how could sentries at checkpoints distinguish friendly troops from Japanese infiltrators trying to slip through American lines under cover of night? The answer arose from an unlikely source: the pronunciation of a single letter. Master Technical Sergeant James W. Herbert, a combat correspondent with the United States Marine Corps Reserve, landed with the invasion forces on August 7. In a March 10, 1943 interview preserved in Naval Archives, Herbert offered first-hand testimony about the security procedure that became standard throughout the campaign. His remarks remain the clearest primary source evidence we have concerning pronunciation testing in the Pacific Theater. "We always had passwords containing the letter L," Herbert explained, because L was believed to be difficult for the Japanese to pronounce, as there is no L in the Japanese vocabulary. This straightforward observation reflected a surprisingly deep understanding of linguistic constraints that proved crucial for American security across the campaign. Herbert noted one important limitation that revealed how the method worked in reality: the test occasionally failed with English-educated Japanese soldiers. This indicated that Marines encountered infiltrators with differing levels of English competence and that the measure, while effective, was not infallible. 1600 hours, 4 p.m. on August 8, Marines had seized the nearly finished Japanese airfield. The airstrip, originally designated Lunga Airfield by the Japanese, was renamed Henderson Field after Major Lofton R. Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. The airfield became operational when the first PBY Catalina flying boat landed on August 12, and by August 20, the permanent air contingent arrived with 31 aircraft. Control of this airfield became the central objective of the entire 6-month campaign, with Japanese forces launching repeated efforts to reclaim it. Security around Henderson Field and the surrounding defensive perimeter became paramount. Japanese troops, showing the tactical adaptability and determination that characterized their operations across the Pacific War, attempted numerous infiltration missions. They moved through the jungle at night, sometimes in small teams, sometimes alone, seeking to gather intelligence, sabotage material, or misdirect American units. Darkness created ideal conditions for such attempts. Sentries posted at perimeter checkpoints had to make instant judgments about whether approaching figures were friendly Marines or enemy raiders. Traditional identification methods were unreliable under these circumstances. Documents could be stolen or forged, uniforms could be stripped from the dead, and physical features were nearly impossible to verify in near total darkness. Even voices were deceptive, as some Japanese soldiers spoke English with varying degrees of fluency. The Marines needed a method that could not be easily faked, something that revealed identity through traits an infiltrator could not consciously suppress. The solution lay in exploiting the phonological structure of the Japanese language itself. To understand why this method worked so well, we must consider the fundamental differences between Japanese and English sound systems. Japanese contains a single liquid consonant, represented in standard Hepburn romanization as R, but pronounced differently from either the English R or English L. Linguistically, this Japanese liquid is classified as an alveolar tap, represented in the International Phonetic Alphabet as. Native Japanese speakers produce it by quickly tapping the tongue against the alveolar ridge, the small ridge behind the upper front teeth. English, by contrast, has two distinct liquid consonants. The English L is a lateral approximant made by placing the tongue tip firmly against the alveolar ridge while allowing air to flow around the sides of the tongue. The American English R is different still, typically produced as a post-alveolar approximant with the tongue pulled back and not touching the roof of the mouth at all. These two English sounds occupy clearly separated positions in the phonetic space, easily distinguished by native English speakers but falling into a single perceptual category for Japanese speakers. This phonological difference is not due to physical inability or hearing deficiency. Japanese speakers can physically produce both English sounds with training, and they can perceive the acoustic distinctions when sounds are isolated. The difficulty is perceptual and categorical. The Japanese language processes both English sounds through a single phonetic category established during early childhood. When Japanese speakers hear English R and L sounds in fluent speech, their brains automatically convert both into the same Japanese liquid. Research conducted during and after World War II confirmed this phenomenon. Studies by Goto, 1971, Miyawaki et al., 1975, and Takagi and Mann, 1995, demonstrated that Japanese speakers struggled to perceive the English or ill contrast even after prolonged exposure. Takagi and Mann found that Japanese speakers who had lived in the United States for more than 12 years still had far more difficulty identifying RNL than native English speakers. The 1975 Miyawaki study revealed something especially relevant to wartime use. When recordings of RNL were altered to sound less speech-like, Japanese listeners could distinguish them about as well as native English speakers. This showed that the problem was not hearing the acoustic cues but interpreting them as linguistic categories. For military security, this meant Japanese infiltrators faced a nearly impossible challenge. Even those who had studied English extensively, who knew grammar, vocabulary, and could hold a conversation, would still betray themselves when pronouncing words containing L. Under stress or fatigue, automatic native language pronunciation patterns resurfaced despite any training or preparation. The effectiveness of this approach rested on how humans acquire language in early childhood, when the brain builds perceptual categories for native sounds that remain extremely stable throughout life and resist change even with intensive adult instruction. The Marines applied this knowledge by using challenge words that included multiple L sounds. According to Herbert's testimony and surviving documentation, passwords routinely incorporated the letter L because Japanese speakers would have difficulty rendering it correctly. When a sentry issued a password containing L sounds, a native English speaker would articulate it automatically and naturally. A Japanese speaker, even one fluent in English, would often substitute a sound closer to the Japanese liquid, producing something clearly off to the trained ear of the guard. One specific word entered the historical record, though it appears in only a single source. Oliver Garland, a journalist with the Associated Press, published Free Men Are Fighting, the story of World War II in 1942 with Farrar and Reinhardt. On page 315, Garland reported that Japanese soldiers would sometimes approach checkpoints posing as American or Filipino troops. He stated that sentries would use a shibboleth such as Lollapalooza, and if the first two syllables come back as roar, the sentry would open fire without waiting to hear the remainder. The word Lollapalooza represents an ideal choice for this purpose if it was indeed used, an American slang term meaning something outstanding or extraordinary. It contains 4 L sounds in rapid succession at the beginning of syllables. Lollapalooza. For a Japanese speaker, each of these L sounds would present difficulty, making it virtually impossible to pronounce the word correctly without extensive training. The instruction to listen specifically to the first 2 syllables makes tactical sense as well. A sentry would not need to wait for the complete password to identify mispronunciation, reducing exposure time during the challenge. However, we must be precise about the evidence. Garling's book is the only known source for Lollapalooza. Specifically, the book was published in 1942, making it contemporary to the events, and Garling was a credible journalist with access to military sources, but no independent corroboration appears in official Marine Corps after-action reports, operational histories, or other memoirs from participants. Richard Trigascus' Guadalcanal Diary, published in 1943 and based on his time as a war correspondent on the island, does not mention the specific word. Robert Leckey's memoir, Helmet for My Pillow, and other first-person accounts similarly do not reference it. What we can state with certainty is that L-based passwords were systematically used as confirmed by Bert's direct testimony. Whether Lollapalooza was one of those passwords remains plausible but not definitively proven. The word fits the tactical requirements appears in a contemporary source and aligns with the documented practice, but additional corroboration would strengthen the claim. The 6-month campaign lasted from August 7, 1942 to February 9, 1943, when Japanese forces successfully evacuated their remaining troops from the island. During this period, the Marines and later Army forces who reinforced them faced constant pressure from Japanese attempts to retake the airfield. Major battles included the Battle of the Tenaru on August 21, the Battle of Edson's Ridge on September 12 to 14, and the battle for Henderson Field on October 23 to 26. Throughout these engagements and in the periods between them, security around the American perimeter remained critical. Japanese infiltration tactics were well documented. Japanese soldiers, often working in small groups or individually, would attempt to penetrate American lines at night. They employed excellent camouflage, often attaching jungle vegetation to their uniforms. They moved with remarkable stealth through terrain they had studied carefully. Some spoke English, and Instances were recorded of Japanese forces attempting to impersonate American personnel. The threat was real and persistent. Burt also noted in his interview an interesting additional security indicator. On at least one occasion, a sentry detected Japanese infiltrators because they used grammar that was much too precise for the average Marine. One infiltrator reportedly said, "Hold your fire, we are American Marines and wish to report our evening's activities," prompting the sentry to fire immediately because I knew no Marine would talk that way. In this context, pronunciation testing provided a reliable method for identifying infiltrators that did not depend on visual confirmation, proper documentation, or even extended conversation. A simple challenge with an L-ound word could expose an infiltrator in seconds. The test worked precisely because it exploited something the infiltrator could not easily fake: the automatic pronunciation patterns established during childhood language acquisition. The term shibboleth itself comes from the Hebrew Bible, from Judges 12 verses 5 to 6, where the Gileadites identified enemy Ephraimites by their inability to pronounce the word correctly. The Ephraimites pronounced it cyth without the esh sound, revealing their tribal identity. Similar linguistic tests have appeared throughout military history whenever forces needed to distinguish friend from foe, and language differences provided a reliable marker. The D-Day invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, used a different linguistic principle for the same purpose. The challenge and password system employed flash as the challenge, thunder as the password, and welcome as the countersign. These words were chosen specifically because they contain sounds that German speakers found difficult. The voiceless dental fricative thief sound in thunder does not exist in German, and the voiced labial va approximate W sound in welcome is also absent from standard German phonology. This parallel use of linguistic shibboleths in the European theater demonstrates that military forces recognize the value of exploiting phological differences for security purposes. Other English phonetic features that Japanese speakers found difficult included the English V sound, which does not exist in Japanese and is typically pronounced as B. The TH sounds both voiced and voiceless, and the English vowel system, which contains many more distinct vowel sounds than the 5 vowels of Japanese. Security-conscious password selection could exploit any of these differences, though the L/R distinction appears to have been the most commonly used based on available testimony. The broader context of security measures in the Pacific theater provides additional perspective. American forces throughout the Pacific faced persistent challenges with infiltration, deception, and the difficulty of distinguishing friend from foe in conditions where visual identification was often impossible. The challenge and password system used by military forces worldwide became even more critical in the Pacific due to several factors unique to that theater. First, the jungle environment of most Pacific battlefields reduced visibility dramatically. Dense vegetation, heavy rainfall, and the frequent use of nighttime operations by Japanese forces meant that sentries often had to make identification decisions based on sound and verbal communication alone. Second, Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized infiltration, night operations, and attacks that sought to create maximum confusion and chaos. The challenge and password system itself has a long military history. In principle, it is simple. A sentry issues a challenge, typically a single word. The person being challenged must respond with the correct password. If the password is wrong or not given, the sentry takes appropriate action. The effectiveness of this system depends on several factors. The challenge and password must be changed regularly to prevent compromise. They must be distributed to all friendly forces while being kept from the enemy, and ideally, they should be chosen to make correct pronunciation by enemy forces difficult. The Military Intelligence Service Language School provides an interesting counterpoint to the pronunciation testing story. Established on November 1, 1941 at the Presidio of San Francisco, MSU moved to Camp Savage, Minnesota in June 1942. Following Executive Order 966, which led to the internment of Japanese Americans from West Coast areas. The school later relocated to Fort Snelling, Minnesota in August 1944 and operated until June 1946. Missiles trained over 6,000 Japanese American soldiers as translators, interpreters, and intelligence specialists during the war. These second-generation Japanese Americans served throughout the Pacific Theater, providing critical language support for interrogations, document translation, and intelligence operations. The contribution of these Japanese American linguists was essential to Allied success in the Pacific. They interrogated prisoners, translated captured documents, intercepted and translated radio communications, and provided cultural insights that helped commanders understand Japanese military thinking. Their service was particularly notable given that many of their families were confined in internment camps while they fought for the United States. For pronunciation testing purposes, these Japanese American soldiers would have passed any L-based challenge automatically. They spoke English with native pronunciation, having acquired the language during childhood in American communities. Their presence in the Pacific Theater, while invaluable for intelligence work, also meant that security forces needed to be aware that Japanese ethnicity did not automatically indicate enemy status. Private First Class Eugene B. Sledge provides one of the few verified personal accounts from an individual who served in the Pacific Theater and later documented his experiences. Sledge enlisted in the Marines and served with K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division. He participated in the battles of Peleliu and Okinawa, fighting in some of the most intense combat of the Pacific War. His memoir With the Old Breed at Peleliu and Okinawa, published in 1981, became recognized as one of the finest first-person accounts of infantry combat. While Sledge did not serve at Guadalcanal during the campaign, he arrived there in 1944 for training after the fighting had concluded. His book does not specifically mention pronunciation testing, focusing instead on the brutal realities of combat, the psychological toll of sustained fighting, and the experiences of Marine infantrymen in the Pacific. The absence of extensive discussion of pronunciation testing in most combat memoirs is itself informative. If the practice was as systematic and elaborate as some popular accounts suggest, we would expect more frequent mentions in the dozens of memoirs written by veterans. The relative silence suggests that while LBS passwords were used, as Hellblatt confirms, the practice may have been more limited or routine than later accounts implied. Security procedures that work effectively often become unremarkable to those using them daily. The eventual Allied victory came at significant cost. American forces suffered approximately 7,100 killed and over 8,000 wounded. Japanese casualties were much higher, with estimates of approximately 31,000 killed, many from disease and starvation, as American naval and air forces interdicted Japanese supply efforts. The successful Japanese evacuation in February 1943 saved approximately 10,000 Japanese troops who were later deployed elsewhere, but the strategic defeat was clear. Japan had lost the initiative in the Pacific and would never regain it. The limitations of pronunciation testing should also be acknowledged. As Herbert noted, it sometimes failed with English-educated Japanese. Any Japanese individual who had spent childhood years in an English-speaking environment would have acquired native-like pronunciation and could pass LBS tests. Japanese intelligence services were aware of this advantage and occasionally employed individuals with English background for intelligence operations. Additionally, in the chaos of combat with artillery fire, explosions, and shouting, subtle pronunciation differences might be difficult to detect reliably. The test also carried risks of false positives. American forces in the Pacific included soldiers from diverse backgrounds, including Filipino scouts and soldiers, Chinese Americans, and others whose English might carry non-standard pronunciations or accents. Security procedures needed to account for legitimate variation in English pronunciation among Allied forces. The phonological differences between Filipino languages and Japanese meant that Filipino English speakers typically had no difficulty with eel and ear sounds, as these phonemes exist in Tagalog and other Philippine languages, but their English might sound different from American pronunciation in other ways. Despite these limitations, pronunciation testing based on L sounds represented an elegant solution to a genuine security problem. It exploited real phological differences, required no special equipment, could be administered quickly, and provided a reasonable basis for identification when other methods were unavailable or unreliable. The test worked because it accessed something fundamental about language acquisition: the fact that phonological patterns established during early childhood remain remarkably stable throughout life and are difficult to modify even with extensive training and conscious effort. The story of pronunciation testing serves multiple purposes today. For historians, it provides insight into the practical details of security operations during the Pacific War. For linguists, it illustrates real-world applications of philological knowledge. For general audiences, it offers a fascinating example of how language itself can become a tool in warfare. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds us to be careful about historical claims and to distinguish between well-documented facts and later embellishments. The verified core of the story is clear and compelling. American forces at Guadalcanal used passwords containing L sounds to help identify Japanese infiltrators who would struggle to pronounce those sounds correctly. This practice was documented by participants. Makes excellent sense given the philological differences between Japanese and English and represented practical innovation in the face of genuine security challenges. The specific word Lalu appears in one contemporary source and fits the pattern perfectly, though independent corroboration would strengthen the claim. Beyond this verified core, many popular accounts have added details that cannot be confirmed, invented statistics that appear nowhere in historical records, an attribution of the practice to a systematic Pacific-wide program for which no documentation exists. These embellishments, while making for dramatic storytelling, distort the historical record and create false impressions about the nature and extent of pronunciation testing. The honest history based solely on verified evidence is remarkable enough without embellishment. It shows American forces adapting to the challenges of jungle warfare, exploiting linguistic differences to improve security, and innovating at the tactical level to address immediate threats. It demonstrates the value of observation, practical intelligence, and willingness to try new approaches. And it provides a window into the daily realities of combat operations in the Pacific Theater, where security, identification, and the constant threat of infiltration created persistent challenges for American forces. The Marines who developed and implemented pronunciation testing deserve recognition for their practical innovation. While the broader context of the campaign reminds us of the human cost of war and the complexity of military operations, the Japanese-American linguists who served in the Pacific, often while their families remained in internment camps, demonstrated loyalty and professionalism under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Their contribution to victory was essential, and their story adds depth and nuance to our understanding of the Pacific War. In conclusion, the verified historical record shows that American Marines at Guadalcanal systematically used passwords containing L sounds to help identify Japanese infiltrators. This practice, directly testified by combat correspondent James Halbut, exploited real philological differences between Japanese and English. The word Lollapalooza appears in one credible 1942 source as an example of such passwords. While broader claims about systematic Pacific-wide testing cannot be verified, the documented use at Guadalcanal demonstrates practical tactical innovation that addressed genuine security challenges. The lessons learned at Guadalcanal, including security procedures like pronunciation testing, informed American operations throughout the rest of the Pacific War. Each subsequent campaign saw improvements in tactics, logistics, and operational coordination. The amphibious assaults that followed from Tarawa through the Marianas, the Philippines, Ioma, and Okinawa built on the foundation of experience gained at Guadalcanal. While we cannot document pronunciation testing at these later battles with the same certainty as at Guadalcanal, the principle of exploiting language differences for security purposes remains sound. The scientific understanding of phonology and language acquisition that explained why pronunciation testing worked came later through research conducted during and after the war. But the Marines at Guadalcanal did not need to understand the linguistic theory to recognize that Japanese speakers had difficulty with English L sounds and that this difficulty could be used to identify infiltrators. This represents the best kind of practical knowledge. Observations derived from experience and applied to Solve immediate problems. The broader implications of this wartime application extend beyond military history. The recognition that language features can serve as reliable identifiers has influenced security procedures in subsequent conflicts. During the Vietnam War, American forces used similar principles, though adapted to different linguistic contrasts. In more recent conflicts, linguistic analysis has become increasingly sophisticated, incorporating voice, stress analysis, and dialect identification technologies that extend well beyond simple pronunciation. Testing. The ethical dimensions of pronunciation testing merit consideration as well. Unlike some security measures that relied on deception or caused physical harm, pronunciation testing was essentially diagnostic. It identified linguistic background without causing harm beyond the security consequences of failed identification. Soldiers who passed the test suffered no ill effects. Those who failed it were identified as potential infiltrators, not through arbitrary discrimination, but through objective phonetic evidence that they lacked the linguistic background they claimed. This relatively benign nature of the testing compared to more violent or coercive security measures meant that it remained acceptable within the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions. The test also highlights an important principle about identity and ethnicity. Japanese Americans serving in the Pacific, such as those with the military intelligence service, passed pronunciation tests automatically because their linguistic identity was American, regardless of their ethnic heritage. This demonstrated that pronunciation testing was fundamentally a measure of language background rather than ethnicity or race. It was the correlation between Japanese citizenship and Japanese language background, not ethnicity itself, that made the testing effective for identifying enemy infiltrators. This distinction, while perhaps not fully articulated during the war, had important implications for understanding the relationship between language, identity, and security. The human dimension of the Guadalcanal campaign extends beyond tactics and security measures. The men who fought there, both American and Japanese, displayed courage, determination, and adaptability in one of the most difficult campaigns of the war. The Americans who developed and implemented pronunciation testing deserve recognition for their practical innovation. The Japanese soldiers who faced these measures were themselves skilled and determined fighters, operating under extremely difficult conditions, fighting thousands of miles from home with increasingly tenuous supply lines. The post-war research into the phonetic phenomena that made pronunciation testing effective has enriched our understanding of how humans acquire and process language. Linguists and cognitive scientists, many of whom had served in military intelligence during the war, conducted extensive studies of second language pronunciation acquisition. Research by linguists like Patricia Kuhl and others demonstrated that infants are born with the ability to distinguish phonetic contrasts from any human language, but that this universal ability narrows during the first year of life as the brain specializes for the phonetic categories of the native language. This neural commitment to native phonetic categories, while essential for efficient language processing, creates exactly the kind of limitations that made pronunciation testing effective during the war. Adult Japanese speakers trying to master English LNR sounds were not simply learning new articulations, they were attempting to rewire neural perceptual categories that had been established decades earlier, a task that cognitive science has since shown to be extremely difficult and often impossible to complete fully. The pronunciation testing used during World War II also influenced linguistic research into the concept of foreign accent. Before the war, accented speech was often viewed simply as incorrect pronunciation that could be fixed through practice and instruction. Post-war research revealed that foreign accent reflects deep structural differences in phonetic processing, not simple errors. This understanding led to more sophisticated approaches to language teaching and to recognition that adult language learners, despite best efforts, will almost always retain some accent features from their native language. For military security, this meant that pronunciation testing would remain a viable identification method in future conflicts where language differences between forces could be exploited for security purposes. The principle has been applied in various forms in subsequent conflicts, though modern technology has added tools like voice stress analysis and linguistic profiling that extend well beyond simple pronunciation testing. The case of Technical Sergeant Paul Yamamoto, a name we cannot verify through historical records, but which represents the thousands of Japanese Americans who did serve, illustrates the complex dynamics of pronunciation testing in a war where American forces included Japanese Americans serving loyally despite the internment of their families. These Nisei soldiers who had grown up speaking English demonstrated through their native pronunciation that linguistic identity could cross ethnic lines. Conversely, Japanese soldiers who attempted infiltration revealed through their non-native pronunciation that linguistic identity was not determined by ethnicity, but by developmental language exposure. The summer of 1945 brought preparations for what many expected would be the final bloodiest phase of the Pacific War. The potential invasion of the Japanese home islands would have placed American soldiers in an environment where enemy infiltration would be even more challenging to detect than on Pacific Islands. Japanese forces would have access to virtually unlimited local resources, civilian attire, and potential support from the local population. In such conditions, dependable identification procedures were absolutely essential. Plans were formulated for comprehensive security protocols that combined pronunciation testing with extensive documentation requirements, physical verification measures, and restricted movement zones. The protocols accounted for the possibility that even with pronunciation testing, some Japanese individuals with early exposure to English or exceptional linguistic talent might attempt infiltration. Multi-layered security provided redundant checks to detect even sophisticated attempts at deception. These plans were never fully executed due to Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but they represented the culmination of years of refinement in linguistic security methods. In the post-war era, many documents relating to security procedures in the Pacific were declassified. Their publication in subsequent decades offered fascinating insights into numerous aspects of Pacific War operations. Historians uncovered detailed records regarding the development, implementation, and effectiveness of various security measures, though direct evidence of pronunciation testing remained largely limited to Hurlbut's testimony and the Gramling account. The story illustrates that military success often relies on countless small innovations devised by those confronting immediate problems and devising practical solutions. Recognizing that language differences could be exploited for identification demonstrated tactical ingenuity and operational flexibility. The systematic use of L-based passwords at Guadalcanal, while perhaps less elaborate than some popular narratives suggest, represented genuine innovation addressing a real security challenge. Today, the episode of pronunciation testing at Guadalcanal stands as a minor but significant chapter in the broader history of the Pacific War. It highlights how language, a fundamentally human trait, can become a factor in warfare. It shows that understanding linguistic differences can yield tactical advantages and underscores that battlefield success often emerges from pairing large strategic decisions with numerous small, practical improvements devised by soldiers on the ground. A careful and honest examination of the historical record reveals both the achievements and limitations of pronunciation testing as a security measure. It was effective at Guadalcanal, giving sentries a quick and reliable means of identifying potential infiltrators. It was logical given the phonological realities of Japanese and English, but it was not flawless, nor a comprehensive Pacific-wide program, nor as elaborate as some popular accounts have suggested. By focusing on the evidence and acknowledging its limits, we honor the memory of those who served in the Pacific while maintaining the intellectual integrity proper to historical study. The Marines at Guadalcanal faced extraordinary challenges during one of the first major American offensives in the Pacific War. Their innovation in creating practical security measures like pronunciation testing, combined with their courage in combat and determination to hold Henderson Field against repeated Japanese attacks, contributed to a strategic victory that altered the course of the Pacific War. The verified essence of the story remains compelling. American forces leveraged fundamental differences in how Japanese and English speakers produce and perceive liquid consonants to devise a security measure that was simple, effective, and difficult to deceive. This application of linguistic insight, whether arising from conscious understanding or practical observation, embodied precisely the kind of tactical innovation that helped secure Allied success in the Pacific.